Well, hello, I'm the J.A. Dad and welcome to the latest video on my channel. Today, I'm going to show you how I built a Fullstack Nextjs application using Convex on the back end and Next.js as my front end framework. In this beginner tutorial, I'll show you how to connect to a Convex database using the Next.js app, how to mutate data by inserting a task into the database, and also querying a Convex database inside of a Next.js app. So what I have is a open directory from my desktop named Next Convex, and we want to install the Next.js project inside of it. So go ahead and open up the terminal and type in the command npx create next app. At latest space, and to install it within this directory, press the space bar, then dot. And for this project, we will not be using TypeScript. We'll say yes to ESLint, yes to Tailwind, no to the SRC, yes to the app router, and no to the import alias. We'll give it a few moments to finish the installation of Next. Okay, once the installation is complete, inside of the root directory, we should have our Next.js project. And if we click on the package.json, we'll see that we have the latest version of Next installed within our application. So before we start the app on our local host, I want to remove some of the boiler code from our project. So within the app directory, let's click on the global.css file. At the top, we have our Tailwind configuration that we installed when we set up our project. What we want to do is remove the default CSS provided by Next so that we have no CSS installed within our app. Go ahead and save this file and close out the CSS. And within the app directory, go ahead and click on the page.js. And then once you click on it, what we want to do is highlight all of the code within this file and let's delete it. And then we want to create a export default and name it homepage, which is going to represent the homepage of our application. If we save this file, this is going to give us the text homepage on the root directory. And to spin up our app, let's go ahead and go back to the terminal and type in the command npm run dev. If we open up a browser and go to localhost 3000, we'll see that we have the text homepage on the screen, which represents the root page of our layout. So now let's turn our focus to setting up our database and integrating it with our Next.js app. If we go to the Convex documentation, on their homepage, we'll see that there's a quick start section, and we see there are several tools and frameworks that can easily connect to Convex. Of course, we'll be clicking on Next.js because that's our front-end application. We scroll down just a little bit to learn how to query our data from Convex to our Next.js app. Make sure that you select the language of JavaScript if you're following this tutorial as I'm setting it up. You're more than welcome to use TypeScript, but just in this tutorial, we'll be using JavaScript. So the first step is to establish a React app. We already have our Next.js app, so we are good to go there. Next, we'll want to install the Convex client and server in our library. So let's go ahead and copy the command npm install convex. If we go back to VS Code and open up a new terminal, paste in the command and press enter. So now we have the Convex dependency installed with an application. Next, we want to install the command npx convex dev. Once we run this command in the terminal, according to the docs, we will be prompted to log in with GitHub. I'm already logged in, so I may not receive the prompt, but you'll need to make sure that you have an account established and be prepared to log in if you're not already logged in. So back in the terminal, let's go ahead and paste in that command and press enter. It's going to ask us if we want to create a new project or choose an existing one. Let's go ahead and create a new project. And feel free to name it whatever you want. I'm going to name it Next Task Manager and just press enter. So within the terminal, you'll notice that we got a response back from the server that the Convex functions are ready. So we don't have any functions established just yet, but I want to show you where we're going to place them once we do. If we go into our root directory, we'll notice that we now have a folder named Convex. This is going to serve as the backend API where we can create the function to interact with our database, and we can provide that function name to our Next.js front end. So within this directory, let's go ahead and establish our backend API. So let's add a file named task.js, and we'll need a few imports to create our first function. Okay, let's go ahead and begin to set up a few imports. The first one will be mutation, and this is going to come from /_generated/server. Next up, we're going to bring in v, and this is going to come from convex/values. Okay, so the first interactivity that we want to establish is the ability to create or insert a task within our database. Let's create an export function named createTask. And we'll set it equal to mutation. And that is going to be an object that we'll want to pass in some information to. The first thing we want to pass in is args. And args are going to represent the argument or the data that we want to insert into our table. The first thing we want to insert is a text. And then we want to access the v, which represents values. And the value will be for the text argument is a string. And then the next value that we want to pass in is status. This is going to represent the status of our task. And we want this to be a Boolean. So we'll go ahead and pass in it. Now, the next thing we want to pass in within our mutation after the argument is a handler. So we'll type in handler. And this is going to be asynchronous. And what we want to pass in is ctx and args. Then let's create a variable named new task ID. And we're going to set it equal to await. And it will be awaiting ctx.db, which is going to give us access to our database. And if we want to access the insert function, and you'll notice that we have quite a few different functions that we can use once we're accessing our database, but we're going to use the insert within this function. And what we want to insert are task. That's what we're going to be naming the table within our database. And then the task that we'll be passing in is text. And that will be args.text, which is coming from the argument that we passed into the mutation. And then the other thing we want to pass in is status. And we're going to set this equal to args.status. Then outside of the new task ID variable, we want to be sure that we are returning the new task ID, which is going to give our front end access to this function and access to the task ID once we return it. So now we're ready to update our front end to integrate with the back end. But before we do so, I want to confirm that our database is set up properly. And Convex makes that easy by giving us a nice database interface that we could take a look at. And within the docs, we'll notice that there's a logo to the far left of the screen. So let's go ahead and click on that logo, and it should redirect us to the landing page. And you'll notice that we'll have GitHub and login. If we go ahead and click on login, it should automatically recognize that we logged in with our GitHub provider during setup and redirect us to our login team page. Within this page, you're going to notice all the projects that you may have set up within Convex. I've been doing quite a bit of testing with it recently, and I like it. So I'm going to be doing a few projects within Convex in the upcoming days and weeks. But for right now, you should notice the new task manager project that we just set up. So let's go ahead and click on that database. And you'll notice that it's now saying that there's nothing here, which we know because we haven't created any tasks to integrate or to insert within the database. So for right now, let's go ahead and just go back to the VS Code, and we can go ahead and close out the task.js file. And within the root directory within app, if we click on page.js, I want to go ahead and just remove all of the code from this file, because we're going to just type out all the code that we need within it and talk through it as we build it out. Now, by default, we know that Next.js is ran on the server. And because we have a separate server already set up, we need to make sure that our application is operating when interacting with Convex as a front-end application. So let's start by adding the use client notation at the top of the file. And because let's bring in use state, because we'll need to manage the state of our task as we update it. Then we want to import API. And this is actually going to come from at convex_generated/API. And if you scroll down of the options, once you type in API, excuse me, I just noticed I added an extra T there. You'll notice that you'll probably have two options. The first one is going to show the create task function that we just created. Here's the API from Convex. That's the one that we want to import. And the second one is just showing that there's a second my function reference that's created. Don't import that one. Otherwise, you won't get access to the task API that you just created. So we'll go ahead and bring that in. And the final import that we want to bring in is use mutation. And make sure you have it typed in as use with a lowercase u and mutation with a capital M. And we want to bring this in from Convex React. So it'll be convex/react. Great. Now go ahead and save the file. That way we make sure we don't lose any of our imports. Then we'll want to create a export default function named home. And then within it, for right now, let's just go ahead and return a message back to the browser. So we'll add return, and then we'll say div, and then within the div, we'll just say hello world. Go ahead and click save. Now, if we go back to our local host, we'll notice that we now have hello world on our home page. Great. So that means that our function is set up correctly. So now let's go ahead and begin to use that create task function and add some form capability to our app. So within the function, we'll need to go ahead and set up a couple state variables. The first one will be for the text and the second one will be for the status. So I'll go ahead and add those now. We'll say const, open bracket text, and then we'll say set text. And then we want to set that equal to use state. And that will be a empty string. Then we want to bring in status, which is going to represent the status of our task. And we want to say set status and set it equal to use state. And then by default, we want to set the status to false, which is going to represent it not being complete. What we'll have the toggle between true and false will be a checkbox. If the checkbox is selected, that'll represent that it's true and that the task is complete. Otherwise, it's going to be unchecked, which will be for false. So by default, we want to say that the task is not complete. Great. Now, underneath the status variable, we want to bring in another variable named create task. And we want to set it equal to use mutation, which is the mutation coming from convex/react. So within use mutation, we want to pass in API. And within the API, we want to get access to the task file that we created. And within it, we want to get access to the create task function, which gives us the ability to create tasks and send it to our Convex database. Okay, awesome. Now, the last thing that we want to do before we begin to update our front end is to create a handle submit function. So let's go ahead and type in const, and we'll create a variable named handle submit. And we'll set it equal to async, and we want to pass in E. And then within this function, we want to first start by saying e.prevent default. Now underneath it, we'll say if there's no text, dot trim. We just want to type in return. This way we'll make sure that there are no empty tasks that's being submitted to the database. Now underneath the simple check validation there, let's add a try catch block. And within the try portion, let's create a variable named const new task ID. And we'll set it equal to await. And we want to get access to the create task function that we're bringing in, that's giving us access to the api.task.createTask function. And within this create task function, we want to pass in text and status, because that's what we'll be getting back from the user. And just to make sure that it is working, we'll check on our front end and also in the database. I just want to log to the console the new task ID. So we'll say console.log. And we'll pass in temporal literals, not open parentheses, because we'll need to pass in some dynamic data. We'll say new task added with ID. And then we can, actually we'll need to stay. And then after ID, let's type the $, then the bracket. And what we want to pass in is the new task ID. This way we'll be able to see it within the console before we go check the database. Then underneath the console.log, let's set the set text state variable to empty. That way it clears out or resets the input status. And then we'll also want to do the same thing with the status of the task. We want to reset it back to false so that the checkbox is not selected. The inside of the catch portion of our try catch block, let's add in console.log, and what we want to log is the error. Now you can certainly take this a step further by adding in some toast notifications of some sort, or maybe even alert to let the user know. But because this is just a simple tutorial, we're just going to keep it simple, and we can always add on to this. The idea behind this is to add on to this to make it more custom and to fit your particular project. This is just designed to get you started. Okay, so now we're ready to update the return portion of our page.js. And I'd like to see this kind of come to life as we type on the screen. So I'm going to make some minor adjustments to my window. Give me just a moment. So now that I have the code editor and our local host side by side, you'll notice that we are getting an error. It is stating that it cannot find the Convex client. So it appears that I did not wrap the application with the Convex provider. So let's go back to the documentation and do so now. So within the Next.js start docs, if we continue to scroll down, we'll notice that there's a client provider that has to be wrapped around the application. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the name of this file name as suggested in docs. And within the root directory, let's create a let's create a file by pasting in the name of the text that we just copied, and let's add .js to the end of it. If we go back to the documentation, there's actually a code snippet that we can just copy, and just be sure that you're copying the JavaScript version of it. Let's paste it into the client context provider file that we just created. Now we can go ahead and close this out, and let's go to our layout.js. In the docs, we need to wrap our application with this. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the Convex client provider that is wrapped around the children within the body tag. And I'm going to go ahead and update my body tag within the layout.js and paste in the code I just copied. And then up top, underneath the global.css, let's go ahead and import the Convex client provider. And this should be coming from @/Convex client provider. This is the file that we just created. So let's go ahead and save this and close out the layout.js. And if we bring our local host back on the screen next to our text editor, we'll see that we're no longer getting the error message and we see hello world on the screen. So that was my mistake. I just forgot to wrap the application with the Convex client provider. But if you just go ahead and add the file to the root directory, add in the provider code, be sure that you have it directly as listed in the docs, and then bring it into the layout.js. That will take care of the error message. That's my apologies. So now we'll return to the page.js file and we'll begin to style our application. So let's remove the hello world and let's begin by, so once we remove the hello world, I'm just going to add some styling. This is totally optional, so just give me just a moment. The first div will have a class name of flex. We'll set the direction to column and we want the width to be full. Within it, we'll add another div and we'll give it a class name of MX Auto. I want the max width of this to be medium. So the width of our text within this div, the maximum width of it will be the medium viewport of the screen. So I'm going to set the max width to medium. We'll give it a little padding of 4. We'll set the width to full. We'll place the items in the center. We'll also say justify center. And then we'll go flex column, and we'll set the height of the viewport to be screen. And just so that we can see what we have, I'm going to add in a quick background color. And I'm just going to type home page so we get something. And then you'll notice that we now have an orange background based on the color. The text is directly in the middle of the screen. And if I expand out my localhost window, you'll see that the content is set to medium width. So everything is going to be within the medium width viewport of our screen. Great. So it is working properly. We can go ahead and remove the background color of orange so that it is set to the normal default color. And then we can remove home page as well. Then I'm going to have a H2. And within it, I'm going to pass in the text. Add a new task, and we'll give the H2 some simple styling. We'll say text of 2XL. We'll set the font to bold. The text color will be neutral, and I'll set it to 700. And if we click save, we'll notice that our text color and size is now updated. Okay, so underneath the H2, let's add a form. And let's give it a class name of width full, flex. We'll set the direction to column, and we'll give it a gap of 4. So there's a little bit of space or padding in between the items. And then we'll pass in a onSubmit function, which will be handling the handle submit function that we just created. And then of course, within this div, we're going to need to pass in a input. The first input is going to be to type in the name of the task. So we'll say placeholder task. Okay, and we see the screen is now updated. Then we'll give it a value of text, and this is going to represent the state that we just created. We want to manage the text state within this input. Then we'll say on change. We want to capture the event, and then we'll say set text, and then we'll pass in e.target.value. That way we are capturing the value from this input, and it will be set to the state variable named text. Then we just want to give a class name to give it some simple styling of border. We'll set the border to gray and we'll make it 400. Give it a little padding of 2. We'll set the input to rounded of medium, the width of full, and the outline of this will have no color. Okay. Now, if we save the file, we'll notice that the border is different. There's no outline with the input, so that took perfectly. Underneath that input, let's add another div. And inside of it, we'll go class name of flex, and we'll set the items to center. And within this div, we want to pass in a label. and give it a class name of margin right of 2. And we'll say this will represent complete. And we now have complete labeled there on the screen. And I can remove that sidebar so you can see a little better. Then after the label, let's pass in an input. And let's give it and within this input, we'll say it has a type of text. Excuse me, it has a type of checkbox. We'll say checked will represent the status state variable that we created. And then, of course, we'll pass in on change. And then we'll say the event will be to set the status. And we'll set it to e.target.checked. Sorry, I hit save before I added the closing tag. So now if you hit save, you'll see that we now have a little checkbox listed here. Great. Now, outside of this div, what we want next is to add a button. And we'll give it a labeling of add task. Click save. And we see that we have the add task button. So now let's just give it a little bit of styling. That way we can see it. So we'll say class name. We'll set the background color to slate 500. We'll make the text white. The padding on the X 4. A little padding on the Y of 2. And we'll say rounded. We'll set it to medium. And then inside of this button, we'll set the type to submit. Okay. So now if all goes well, a couple things should happen. Number one, if we add in a new task, we should see the task ID within the console. And we also should see a new task entered into our database that has the title and also whether it is complete or not. So let's go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to set a task of exercise for today. And I'm going to say that it is not complete. Once we press add task, we notice that the input is clear, because we set the status to be an empty string once we've successfully clicked add task. If we look in the console, we'll see that we have a new task ID with ID, and that's listed here. So now let's go to Convex and take a look at the database and see what's listed inside of it. You'll notice that we now have one document within our table, and that is the task that we just created. The text is set to exercise, which is a string. The status is set to false. Remember, we did not select the complete checkbox. And we have the ID that ends in X79K within our task document. And if we look back in the console, this task ID ends in X79K as well. So now we want to add in the ability to display the task onto the screen. That will mean that we'll need to set up a query. So let's go ahead and work on that now. So before we set up our backend API to query our database to get our task, let's go back to our Convex database, and I want to integrate a schema for validation purposes within our app. So we'll go ahead and head back to the database interface now. So within our dashboard at the bottom, you'll notice that we have a button that reads Generate Schema. What'll happen is Convex will provide a recommended schema for our database that we can simply just add into the backend API by creating a schema.ts or schema.js file in our case. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy the code that we see on screen. Let's go back to our VS Code, and within the Convex directory, let's add a file named schema.js. And within it, we can simply paste in the code that we just created. So now we'll have access to it within our API for validation purposes. So now if we go into the Convex folder and click on the task.js file, let's go ahead and create the GET request to get all of the tasks from our database query. So let's create a function named export const get task. And we're going to set this one equal to query. And be sure that you're selecting the one that's being imported from /_generated/server. It should go right along with the mutation that we've already brought in. Then within query, we want to pass in the handler, and that will be a async request. And we'll pass in CTX. And what we want to return is ctx.db.query. And we should have access to task now. And we do. And what we want to query is task, and we'll pass .collect outside of the parentheses so that we can get all of the tasks within the database. Great. Let's go ahead and save this file and close it out. Now, if we head back to the page.js where our home page is at, what I'd like to do is just render our task below the form that we just created. So the first thing we'll need to do is update our imports. Back in our page.js file, let's go ahead and begin to update the code so that we can display the tasks from the database. So within the first import, where we have use mutation, we also want to get access to use query. And this is coming from Convex React. So let's create a const named task and set it equal to use query. And what we want to use within, or we want to call within query is api.task.getTask. And then we'll say, or we want to pass in a empty array. And in this way, we can display a message to the user in the event there are no tasks within the database. But of course, we have tasks within hours. So underneath the form, let's add in another div. And within this div, we want to pass in a class name. And we'll pass in the class name and give it some styling or some direction of flex. We'll set the flex to column. We'll give it a gap of 8. And we'll set the width to full. Within the div, we'll create a H2. And as a matter of fact, we'll just take the same H2 that we just created for the add task portion of the page. And I'm just going to add the text to be center for this H2. And if we click save, we'll see that it is now listed on the screen. We'll give it a little bit of margin top of 8 so that there's some space between the button and the add task word. And I think I'm just going to update add task now so that it just reads all task. We'll add an S. Great. Now underneath the H2, let's go ahead and add another div. And within this div, we want to display all tasks from our database. So I'm going to start out by just writing task.length is equal to 0. We want to pass in a p tag for a paragraph that reads no task available. And outside of the closing parentheses, let's add in or, and let's open up some more parentheses. And within this, what we want to do now is loop over all of the tasks if there are tasks in the database. And we'll say for each task, we want to name it task. And we want to display some information to the screen. So we'll start out by saying task.map. And we're going to call each task a task. And for each task that we have, I want to return a div. And this div, this div will need to pass in a key. And the key is going to be task._ID. Remember, that is how the IDs are stored within our database. Then we'll create a class name and give it direction of flex. Set the items to center, and we'll set the width to full. And within this div, we'll create another div. And we'll give it a class name of flex. We'll say justify between. We'll set the items to be centered on the x-axis. We'll set the width to full. We'll give it some border and a padding of 4. And within this div, we'll add one more div and we'll give it a p tag. And within this, just go ahead and pass in the task text just to make sure that it's working. So within the p tag, we'll pass in some brackets and we'll say task.text and click save. And we see that we now have the task name of exercise, which is what's in our database. So that's great. And then now outside of this div, let's pass in another div. And within this div, we want to pass in a p tag and we want to set it to task.status. And we'll need to add a little additional code so that we can display it, because remember, it is being stored as a Boolean in our database. And we see that we now have the status, which is incomplete. And I just noticed that I put with fit versus with full. And if we update it and save the file, we see that it immediately sets the width to full. So now that we can see the tasks that are within our database, so I'm going to add another one just to make sure that we immediately get it within our list of tasks. So we'll say coding, and I'm gonna mark this one as complete, and I'm gonna click add task. And we see it immediately appears below that the title is coding and the status of it is complete. So there you have it, a simple full stack application using Nextjs14 on the front end and a Convex database. So that concludes today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to give me a like and consider subscribing. Leave any feedback or suggestions in the comment section below, and I'll be happy to take a look at them and follow up. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Love you, man.